I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Now, when you go into the bicycle narrative, it's not the bicycles themselves, it's the going into that area that seems to open up so many different cans of worms and other possibilities, because through the bicycle narrative, you find out a little bit more about Burke, you find out a little bit more about JonBenet, you find out a little bit more about what they were doing on Christmas Day and who their friends were, who they were playing with. When you follow the bicycle narrative, you also find out that bicycles were moving around the Ramsey home in different ways. And it makes you think of different places in the Ramsey home that you might not have thought of before, let alone seen before, such as the garage. And there's been so much focus on footprints in the snow. What about those lines that are clearly evident in the snow? Those bicycle tracks in the snow. What about that? And if you have bicycle tracks remaining in the snow, then why don't you have any footprints in the snow? Now, I've always thought the crucial question in terms of the bicycles is simply a number. Were there 2 new bicycles in the Ramsey home, which is what they seem to be based on the police statements John and Patsy gave, or are there 3 new bicycles? And I think after 27 years, certainly another 7 years after I started writing books on this case, I think we can also ask a third question. Could there have been 4 brand new bicycles? In other words, didn't every single member of the Ramsey family get a brand new bike that Christmas? I mean, it was a phenomenal Christmas in a sense. JonBenet was kind of on fire in terms of her pageants. John's business was doing phenomenally well. Patsy had just turned 40 years old. Burke was about to turn 10 years old. So why not have a family celebration involving everyone? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'll be doing a live recap of my journey through America, where I literally visited 9 different crime scenes with a fabric of 9 different cases. And I'll be sharing some of that with you a little bit later. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So here's the simple question. Were there 4, 3, or 2 brand spanking new bicycles in the Ramsey home? And as I say, that question kind of starts opening up other cans of worms. And you might say, even if you answer that question, where does it really take you? But the counter to that is, why are we getting inconsistent statements from John and Patsy about, or seemingly inconsistent statements about something that is harmless, something that is inconsequential? Why is there kind of a big deal being made out of this from law enforcement? Because this is a simple question. How many bikes were in the home? New bikes. It should be easy to answer. Instead, there is a great deal of intrigue around this. Even in the photographic narrative, it's been very unclear where the bicycles are and who the ones that you do see, who do they belong to? A green bicycle was clearly the big gift JonBenet got that year, but it's unclear who else got a similar gift. Why? Well, why is this part of the narrative so cloudy? And that brings us to the photographic narrative. The image of JonBenet sitting on a bicycle seems like the bicycle narrative was never in doubt. But this image of JonBenet proudly sitting on her bike was only released 2 years ago for the first time. Said in another way, this image was held back for around 25 years. Take note of the wheel with a reflector in the background and the relatively thin tire around the rim of that wheel. Many have assumed from this image where you see that silver bike, it's a woman's bike, that because it was tightly cropped in news stories with the silver bicycle in the background, many assumed that that was JonBenet's bicycle. Some have assumed the bicycle in the foreground was either Burkes or Patsy's. Steve Thomas in his book itemized the silver bike as the gift JonBenet got for Christmas. He wrote, Joe and Betty Barnhill, the elderly neighbors so trusted by the Ramseys that JonBenet's silver Christmas bicycle had been hidden with them, would also eventually be pointed out as suspects. Now, you would imagine Steve Thomas wouldn't get a detail like that wrong, and you would also imagine that they'd spoken to the Barnhills, and the Barnhills had said, oh yes, there was a silver bicycle with us. In the background of the image below, you can see what appears to be a third bicycle distinct from the other two based on the width of the tire on the one hand and the type of handlebars and the almost horizontal handlebar stem on the other. Cut out of the image below seems to be the same reflector we see in either the green or the silver bike just below JonBenet's hand. How many bicycles do you see in this image? And is one of them JonBenet's green bicycle? And one easy way to count the number of bicycles, John is in the garage. And one way to count the number of bicycles is if you look at the top right of the image, you can see 3 different bicycle rims, 3 separate bicycle rims. Now, obviously, this image is cut off. There could possibly be additional bicycles in that garage. But those look to me like newish bicycles, certainly the 2 in the front. And so the question is, that bicycle in the back, was that JonBenet's bicycle, or is that an old bicycle? So do you see the photographic narrative is far from clear? I've got to tell you, it was really difficult getting hold of some of these photos. One thing I've never seen in any photos of the Ramseys is Burke on a bicycle. And yet that idea repeatedly comes up in the semantic narrative. And even if you find a photo of Burke on a bicycle, compare that to the number of times you see JonBenet on a bicycle. You see JonBenet growing up and repeatedly on bicycles of different sizes. And that brings us to the semantic narrative. I've received a lot of criticism, often in my book reviews, for focusing so much on a seemingly unimportant aspect. But in the 1998 police interviews, the word bicycle is mentioned 10 times in John's statement, bike an additional 24 times, so 34 times in total. The transcript for Patsy's 1998 interview contains 11 references for the word bike and 8 more for the word bicycle. Aggregate mentions of bicycle, or its abbreviated version bike, come up to over 50 times. And remember that law enforcement had a limited time that they were allowed to talk to the Ramseys, a limited number of questions. They had to get through everything basically in a limited space of time, certainly not more than one day. And so the fact that they spent so much time with both parents talking about bicycles, I think there's a reason for that. And if they are asking questions, maybe we should too. So let's look at this section from the transcript. Lou Smit hands a sheet of photographs to John Ramsey. Kind of strangely or cryptically, John seems to say 0779. Brian Morgan says, and that's John's lawyer, says, if I understand it, all of these were taken in the early stages of the kidnapping scenes, which means early in the morning. Lou Smit, yes. John, these tracks in the snow here might have been bicycle tracks. John volunteers this. John is drawing Lou's attention to bicycle tracks in the snow in the front garden. Lou Smit, that's in photograph 101. John Ramsey, right. It wasn't unusual for him to ride through the yard. Who do you think him is a reference to? It's to Burke, right? Burke riding a bike through the yard in terms of the front garden. Lou Smit, did you say he had a bicycle that Christmas? John Ramsey, I know I got a bicycle. I think that's what it was. I gave myself a bicycle. It's quite interesting that he isn't certain. I think that's what it was. And he doesn't seem to say that he rode around the front garden himself. Lou Smit, that Christmas. John Ramsey, yeah. So even Lou's a little bit doubtful. You gave yourself a bicycle that Christmas? That seems to be news to Lou. And bear in mind, Lou has also made a study of all the photos, all the crime scene photos. He found the Mindhunter book. He doesn't seem to know that there was a bicycle for John that Christmas. John says, yeah, Patsy got a bicycle, I got a bicycle, JonBenet got a bicycle, Burke already had one, I'm pretty sure. I don't know what it is, I guess inaudible. So he's basically saying that there were 3 bicycles in the home, 3 new bicycles, 3 Christmas bicycles, and then an older one that Burke already had. In other words, 3 family members got a Christmas bicycle, but not Burke. It's interesting that John doesn't answer Lou Smit's question directly when Lou says, did Burke get a bicycle that Christmas? It's a yes or no question. Instead, John says, I got a bicycle. Everyone gets a bicycle, as I say, but one is missing. One new bicycle is missing, Burke's bicycle. Now, I understand the explanation that they were going to give Burke a bicycle on his birthday, right? A month later, at the end of January. But I've always had a hard time thinking the Ramseys would splurge on new bicycles for everyone, but then leave one person out, because the idea was for them to all go bicycling together. And you might say they could still do that. Burke could go on his old bicycle. In his interview with Dr. Phil, Burke said, we both got bikes, meaning for Christmas. And that seems to contradict John's version of events, that Burke specifically didn't get a bike.
I remember peeking down, and I remember seeing like an electric train and a bike, and I was super excited.
Was JonBenet with you?
Yeah.
Did she peek too?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Did you get what you had asked for that year?
Nintendo 64.
And what did JonBenet get?
I think she got a big dollhouse. We both got bikes.
That's a contradiction from 2016 to what John Ramsey said in 1998. In fact, there's even a contradiction within John Ramsey's statement, what he says at the beginning of it and what he says at the end of it regarding the bicycles. Now, I know it may seem like the bicycle JonBenet got as a Christmas gift is not significant, but it was really the last thing she did under the light of day in her short life. And curiously, 0 bicycles appear in any crime scene photos. Ramsey family photos, yes. Crime scene photos, no. Think about that. There are 3, perhaps even 4 brand new bicycles in the home. And it's a messy home with things lying around everywhere. Flashlights and a pillow in the kitchen, baseball bats lying all over the garden, train tracks in Burke's room, paraphernalia lying all over the place, including washing. Really? Were bicycles the one thing everyone packed up? Everyone took to a cold garage and packed up, but literally nothing else. Back to one of the transcripts, John Ramsey, well, we'd get up, haul the presents and put them under the tree, and a lot of the things were not wrapped, so the kids had the surprise when they came down, and we put those out and we got the bike. Now, from what Burkes just said, it does sound like perhaps the dollhouse, and what's the other thing? I think a train set, and perhaps the bicycles weren't wrapped and they could obviously see those. Lou Smit asked, where would you keep these bikes? John, they were usually in the basement. That was Patsy's department, but I think she kept them in that cellar room. And so in this part of his statement, he describes Patsy's bike being in the garage. But what about the third bike? Where was that? The basement? The garage? Or also at Joe Barnhill's? Bear in mind, if there was a third bike and the third bike was Burke's, where was that bike? Let me say that again. That third bike, was it with Joe Barnhill? Well, it doesn't seem like it. Was it in the garage? Well, nothing is mentioned. Was it in the basement, specifically in the wine cellar? Burke's bicycle. John Ramsey. I don't remember specifically. Lou Smit says, kind of think about it because it's important. John says, We certainly both would have gone down into the wine cellar because Patsy did most of her wrapping down there. And that's where all the present stuff was stored. That's in the wine cellar. And so he says, so in the process of getting ready for Christmas, that would certainly have been down there and been in there. The only thing I remember is going over to Joe's and getting the bike out of his garage. And then after Patsy went upstairs, I had her bike in our garage and got that out and put it there. And then I went upstairs. There's no mention from him here either of Burkes' bike or of his own bike. Lou says, so both bikes then were at the tree. You just took the one from Joe Barniel and put it by the tree. John Ramsey says, and brought Patsy's in from the garage. In this part of the narrative, which is in the first 10% of his statement, there seems to be just two bicycles. A bicycle for JonBenet and a bicycle for Patsy. And Lou Smit is using the word both repeatedly. And John isn't correcting him or adding anything to that. John says, yeah, that's right. And then Lou Smit asks about a painting that had been kind of hidden behind a couch. And he describes it as a painting of some boats at anchor that Patsy had seen in a local art store. But then Patsy's going to give a totally different account of this painting. She's going to say she painted it and it was a painting of golf or something. Unless there are two paintings. Anyway, let's go on to the next part of this. If you follow the bicycles through and around the Ramsey home, where do you end up? Well, you end up in the garage, which is a place we never go to. You end up in the wine cellar, with the idea that possibly Burkes, a big gift that Burke was going to get was in the wine cellar. Would that not be a reason, if Burke wanted to know what he might be getting for Christmas, that Burke himself might want to go into the wine cellar? The Ramseys were given ample opportunity to get their statement straight. This interview was about a year, almost 2 years, a year and a half after the incident. And yet in this one critical area, their statements are really inconsistent. They're divergent, if not downright contradictory. As I said, guess what the last thing is JonBenet did on her last day on Earth? She was riding her bike. Has anyone ever explored the fabric of that? Where did she go and where could she have been seen? Who was she riding with? Who else had bikes in that neighborhood? And so when Tripp asks Patsy these questions, guess what comes up? The bike narrative. Tripp says to Patsy, take your time when you're wrapping presents and what have you, getting things ready, and JonBenet is riding her bike a little bit. This is on Christmas Day. Patsy says, well, she rode her bike. We were out there when she was riding her bike. We were out there. Who's we? One assumes it's at least herself and John. And isn't it Burke perhaps as well? Isn't anyone else riding a bike because Patsy got a bike as well? Tripp says, okay, there's a time when John goes to the airport, right? Patsy says, right. Tripp, and the kids were playing with their toys and what have you, right? And lunch. Now, in the Charlotte Cena case, we had a scenario where Charlotte was seen on her bicycle, last seen on her bicycle, and the route she took with her bicycle is ultimately what led to the site where she was taken. The bicycle is left behind and Charlotte is taken. And she's taken while she's riding a bicycle. I think on a second loop or something. And there's a case where the bicycle narrative is fundamental and foundational to the substance of that case. Tripp says, were there any excursions or outings that Fleet White took your children on as well as his children? Patsy says, I'm sure there probably were. Tripp, any that you recall? Patsy says, not right off the top of my head. I mean, we went biking, meaning the Ramsey family, I think, went biking with the White family on the bike trails around Boulder. And she says, once all together, all of us. Tripp says, would Fleet ever babysit children? And Patsy responds to that. Now, a narrative you almost never hear discussed is which little boys Burke's age were regularly playing at the Ramsey home. And it's when you simply acknowledge the bicycle narrative in the transcripts that this aspect comes up front and center. Interestingly, this was a line of thought uppermost in the cops' minds in 1998, not in April 1997. Tom Haney says, let's take it easy. What about, do you guys put on a big production? Are the presents hidden? Patsy Ramsey, no. Patsy's saying the presents aren't hidden. Tom Haney, a lot of presents out? Patsy, yeah. Tom Haney, big ones? We have the Nintendo and a bike. Patsy says they didn't put on a big production. Is that an accurate statement? I think the Ramsey Christmas is one of the biggest Christmas productions I've ever seen. What about you? She also says the presents weren't hidden when John says they were. And we know a lot of effort went into hiding, particularly JonBenet's bike. And the presents were hidden in the wine cellar, which can be secured with a little latch at the top, which in a way makes it childproof. It does make sense to hide the gifts there. And there were gifts still hidden there. I mean, a gift was found still wrapped in that room when JonBenet was found. So why not say, yes, we did hide away the gifts? Why is there an inconsistency there? I'm not going to take it much further than that in this episode, although there's quite a lot more to say about it. What I can say is, when I was writing books about the Ramsey case, I was certain Burke didn't get a bike for Christmas and that this may have caused an argument. But now I think he did get a bicycle, and that bicycle may have been hidden after the fact or disappeared after the fact for a different reason. It may also be the reason why so few photos of the Ramsey Christmas of 1996, let alone video, have ever been released, because you probably see that bicycle or possibly see that bicycle and wonder what happened to it. John Ramsey, at the end of the 1998 interview, says the following: well, JonBenet got a bike. I think Burke got a bike too. It seems like we had 3 bikes there. And that is a different statement to what he said right at the beginning, where he said, I got a bike. And if he's saying we had 3 bikes and he's saying I got a bike, well, then there's a mistake somewhere. When he says, I think Burke got a bike, he means I think Burke got a bike for Christmas, not that Burke got a bike just a little later. And John is capable of excruciating detail. He says, I think JonBenet got a little doll that was one of these look-alike dolls that was supposed to look like her. And I remember her looking at it and saying, this doesn't look like me. Lots of detail there. So can you see how in the same interview, John in the first 10% says that Burke got a bike for Christmas, but then in the final 10%, right at the end of the interview, it's in the very end, where they could be talking about anything, it comes up again and he says he thinks that bike is the bike he bought for himself. He says, well, Burke got a bike, but not that year. And that's when Lou Smit says, I've looked at a lot of pictures in regards to this particular case, and I can't remember seeing any bikes. And he then says, what happened to the bikes? That's a major statement. That's a major admission from Lou Smit, wouldn't you say? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.